Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Lesbian Visibility Day of Action on April 24th, 2022. We have had an incredible day so far, and we are striving on to a next beautiful program. We're going to be talking with Kai Van Vlack on all things that this entire program has encompassed. I think that was my intro. Yeah, thank you so much for you guys to be here and everyone here for being here and Kai for being here.
Thank you for having me, Suyane.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, we're going to be talking about DIY. We're going to be talking about community organizing. We're going to be talking about punk, Stone Butch Blues for sure, because we're threading that into our entire day. But let's start off with talking about you, Kai. And I don't know any other way to ask this, but like, without it sounding like a job interview, but like, tell me who you are.
I can do that.
Who don't know, yeah.
Hi, I'm Kai Van Vlack. I use she, her pronouns. what am I? I live in Providence, Rhode Island right now, and I'm the Programs and Operations Coordinator at Riot Rhode Island, which is a youth music education org. We work primarily like with young people of color in the like Providence area, and try to target our programming at like queer and trans youth, and I think are quite effective in that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also an artist in residence at the Dirt Palace, which is like a legacy feminist art collective that I'm really proud to be a part of. I play in a band. I play in a grind band called Trophy Hunt.
A very good band.
Thank you. And yeah, I don't know. I've been in like punk, DIY, radical space in the interstice of that for like, I guess my life since I was like 13 years old. If I can like go into my background a little, like I grew up in Manhattan in New York City, and my parents are both punks. They both played in bands and like had me really young, so I really grew up in that subculture like while they were still in it. Like my dad was touring in bands like when I was a baby, and in fact still does. And yeah, I think as soon as I think I told my mom when I was like 12 that I felt like I was being pressured into pursuing music, and she's like, by who? And I think like I was mistaking external pressure for like an inner desire, you know, or and so like very quickly got caught up in it, but didn't play music or anything. Like I just wanted, like I was going to shows at the time, and really swept up in like alternative culture, because I think very early identified my difference in terms of like how I was viewing the world, and like as soon I think like middle school age is like when you're starting to articulate like what are you hoping to express in your life, or like how are you viewing the world. And I just saw myself diverging really hard from my peers, and I think some of that has to do with like mental health stuff. Like I was a really depressed kid, and just like wasn't able to mesh easily, though I had friends that I would say were like normies for all that's worth, you know. But like yeah, I don't know, punk culture was a draw because everyone seemed fucked up in a way that didn't make my fucked upness feel so horrible. And I mean, there's like, that was a little toxic and maybe damaging to me, but at the same time, like there was a weird safety in it, because I think like I just didn't feel well understood in my peer group. I felt persecuted, and I think I was by the administrations of the schools I was in. I grew up I'm a second generation kid. Like my grandparents immigrated here from the Dominican Republic and Peru, and my father is an orphan, so I never knew his grandparents. So I grew up in a like immigrant family, but like I think in New York City, being like Peruvian and not not obviously Latina is like difficult because you're in this like middle ground that again, like I felt this very strong separation because most of the kids in my schools were like Mexican or Dominican and like I was not those things.
Mhm.
So like, you know, as much as like I think externally from a white lens, it's easy to imagine like, oh, you're all Latinos. Like, no, it's really not the same. You know, and South American, as I'm sure you know, is like quite a bit different from Caribbean culture or Mexican culture. Hi, buddy. and so, yeah, I think I was in a place of feeling very disempowered and hurt because of my neurodivergence, because of my ethnicity, because of, you know, I started cross-dressing really young. And like I had girlfriends and stuff that would like lend me clothes. And like I was hanging out with like other goth kids. And I think goth kids in particular are very receptive to like gender variance.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience anyway.
Okay.
And like everyone was sort of queer and like, well, here's the sad story. This sounds really fun, but like, I think like 13, 14, 15, I was really on that track. And then I had this hard turnaround where I was like, no, I don't want to be that. I want to live a normal life, you know? And I tried that for a little while and I wasn't very good at it.
I think that age is like where kids, 13, 14, 15 is like where kids like really need the most like freedom to express themselves and like do whatever they need to do to like figure themselves out. And then as soon as you hit like 15, 16, it's like peer pressure really settles in and you don't want to be ostracized.
Totally. And I, you know, for better, I mean, for worse, honestly, overall, I developed this like strong sense of just not wanting to stick out at a certain point and like kind of fearing the like embarrassment of like, you know, it's funny, like when I was graduating middle school, I talked to my middle school was attached to a high school, and there was like an older goth kid who I really looked up to. And I told him, I was like, you know, I'm thinking of walking for graduation in a dress, you know? And I think from a place of genuine care, but, you know, something that was quite damaging was he was like, well, I think you should think about like, if you do that, like these people that you're around are not just going to go away. Like you might end up going to high school with these people, like they might come up in your life and you should think about whether you can live that down. And I was like, well, damn, you know, and that really, I think like pushed me back into the closet in a deep way. And I don't think he was trying to be damaging. Like he's right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and I couldn't hack it. Like I was not brave enough at that time to like be out and queer in that way. But I think simultaneously, like I was just talking about like, I grew up like in my eye pretty poor. My mom argues with me about this, but like I know what my experience was. And I didn't have money. Like I was begging on the street as a child, you know, like, so I experienced myself as having had an impoverished life. But New York, I really think is like one of the best places on earth to be a poor person.
Why is that?
Well, I think there's just a ton of amenities. Like it's very easy to come across free food. It's relatively easy to sleep in the street without getting hurt. Like that can happen to you, of course, but I think a lot of other places where I've, you know, had to sleep on the street were much more dangerous, you know? I think in New York City, because so many people are sleeping on the street, you're much more likely to get left alone.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
But I think like, so I was lucky enough to go to school very near a youth center called The Door, which is quite famous. And actually my mom also went there when she was pregnant with me. And I was able to get like healthcare through that and like therapy to a certain degree and free food and shit like that. So I was like set in that way. And like, and I, you know, I think I got involved in punk because I just like, I would get out of school and just feel like if I was really depressed again and like, I just didn't want to go home, you know, like I just didn't want to go home. And luckily, like there's a lot of places in New York City to go and just like do punk shit, you know, and like hang out and be involved in street culture. And like literally like live in the street in not a totally terrible way, you know, like not like I would not go home for weeks and like for longer when I got older. And I think like, you know, I started going to shows that like ABC No Rio, which is again another very famous institution, which unfortunately doesn't exist right now, but is coming back. I do know that.
Okay.
They're getting a whole new building, and we're all waiting with bated breath. But for those of you that don't know, ABC No Rio is another like legacy art space that grew out of like the squatting subculture of the 70s and 80s in the Lower East Side, and who luckily enough got to keep their building after things turned over in the 90s. And they operated a free print shop and operated pay what you can shows and like would let people just hang out in the space and bring people into that collective really regularly to try to foster DIY culture on the other side. And I was very lucky to, that's the thing is like, I don't think I was very heavily involved on the doing side of DIY culture as a child. I think I was mostly the beneficiary of that culture. Which I think is appropriate for like being a kid, but I got to go to a lot of cool shows and I got to connect with art, and like, and again, like connect with queer culture in a way that like didn't totally sink in until I was quite a bit older. I think for me, and if you want to interrupt me, when I know I'm going on it, like
no, you are actually like that's right. I was like, how did you know I was asking all of these questions?
We talked a little.
But we talked a little about the questions. I was like, you are literally like bullet by bullet, like hitting all the questions. I love it. Keep going.
I thought about it. I prepared. So, it's hard for me to say that I'm a lesbian, even though like that's very much how I think of myself. I sometimes worry I'm committing an act of violence against like the non-binary people I've loved in my life, but I have not dated men at all in my life. I'm very much like, I think oriented towards being with women. And I think when I think one of the reasons I went into the closet so hard is like when I was in high school and, to date myself a little, I was in high school in the mid thousands. I was born at the tail end of the 80s. So I am very like middle millennial. I was like, well, I'm not a gay boy. And I know what transgender is, and I very much fantasize about being a woman, and that I very much like want to be, and could articulate from a very young age that like if I could have chosen, that's what I would be. But all the trans women I knew liked men. And so I was like, well, I don't like men, so I guess that's not me. There was not really, I'm sure there was, but in my world, there was not the idea of a trans lesbian. Like that wasn't a thing you could be. And honestly, like even, in my early 20s, I got involved at the like feminist bookstore in New York City, Blue Stockings, which is another a great legacy, very famous place. And I started by just hanging out there, and a woman who hung out there a lot. Once I wasn't directly involved in this conversation, but once was like, trans lesbian, I don't think that's a thing. Which like, fuck her in retrospect, but I was kind of like, yeah, I guess not. You
didn't have like you didn't see that person in your life, right?
Again, I think I approached things from like a really disempowered place for a very long time and didn't feel like the authority to define my own terms, very much at the whim of like the way other people describe the world to me.
Absolutely. And we actually talked about this, again, I'm bringing up our book club that we had that we read Stone Butch Blues, and you can also find evidence of this in Stone Butch Blues, which is like the fact that labels can like either like we can wear them as armor, right, to protect ourselves and be like, this is who I am, or like they can really hurt us. And I feel like lesbians, not in particular, but like especially like from me planning this day, I like am a lesbian. I don't technically identify with that word. Like I prefer dyke just because of stuff that I've gone through in my life, but I feel like if we had a more encompassing, like a more intersectional community, labels wouldn't be such a thing that like people say, if you're this, you can't be this and this, like,
Totally. And I think that is the utility of it. I talk all the time. I feel like anyone who knows me knows that I have this conversation where like, you know, one of the damaging things people ask you when you're coming out as a trans person is like, well, how do you know? How do you know? What does that mean to you? You know, how can you be sure? And the very honest answer is, I can't. I don't know. I mean, I don't know any better than anyone else does. I think this is what feels comfortable. I mostly don't use these categories to define who I want to be a community with, you know, like, and yeah, I think to a certain degree, it's like, you know, I'm a trans woman. I use she, her pronouns. I very publicly don't like people using they, them pronouns for me. It doesn't feel good. But do I believe, am I a binary trans woman? I mean, I guess as a term of convenience, but I don't even actually believe that's a thing. If we're getting really theory crafting here, I don't think there is such a thing as a binary trans identity. I think it's a contradiction in terms. Yeah. You know, like you are necessarily transgressing the binary. Yeah. Right. And I mean, like you're saying, Stonebush. I mean, I'll tell you, I only read that book very recently, and going through it, I'm just like so depressed that I didn't read it when I was much younger, because I think I could have saved myself some grief.
Yeah. You know, I was actually rereading it as well. I didn't reread the whole thing, but because the day is about it and we had our book club about it, I was like, you know, scrolling through, and actually I also just recently read Stonebush Blues. And as soon as I read it, I was like, oh my God, I think everybody in the queer community can identify with something, because it is about lesbians, it is about butches, it's about trans people. And like me as like a cis femme dyke, I identified with it so hard, even though like femmes weren't very a part of that book. I feel like everybody should read that book. So I'm like a huge advocate for that book. And as soon as I found out that like they were reprinting that book at cost, I was like, everybody needs to find it. Everybody needs to read it. Like, this is my queer Bible. And then I was actually just reading in the last pages where like Leslie wrote, here's like testimony or like author, the last few pages of the book where like the author is like, this stuff. I forget what that's called.
Like
is that an
afterward.
index? Like an afterword, yeah. I like an afterword. Leslie wrote, please don't like share this book. I want this book to be drawn, like I want people to be drawn to this book. Like I don't want this book to be put onto people. Which is why I think maybe a lot of, because I didn't read that until just recently, but I feel like a lot of people don't know about this very important, very easy read book that like will speak to, I think, all of the queer community.
Well, and honestly, I think like it would be great if cis people would read it. As like cis straight people, like you know, like something I articulate a lot in my life is that like I want queer theory for cis straight people. I want them to examine their concepts, and like you can still be cis and straight, that's cool. Like I just want you to know that you are. I want you to check, you know, like and I think everyone deserves that opportunity to do that introspection.
You have to like look in.
And in that way, I think like there's no one who couldn't benefit from reading this book. I'm astonished by how prescient Z's writing is in terms of articulating an intersectional politic at a time when that was really like difficult to do.
Yeah.
You know, like it's the book is really not it's very relevant, you know, like
super relevant.
It feels like a really excellent primer on how to approach things as a intersectional feminist. And I feel that my feminism has been enriched by reading it, because even at this point in my life, and I consider myself to be very like resolutely out living my life as a woman, you know, being recognized for what I am, like I still think I have something to gain by it, you know.
Absolutely.
I think it also helps that Z just knows how to write a sentence, you know. It's very compelling.
It's a very like easy, like I think that well, obviously Leslie was a communist, and I just their writing clearly shows. His writing clearly shows that they wanted this book. He wanted this book to be accessible to literally everybody. like same with like Audre Lorde, or sorry, not Audre Lorde, Bell Hooks was like, I want my mom who had like a high school education to be able to read my books. And I think that's what Leslie wanted for all the queers. Like we're probably like we're one of the most underserved communities, and sometimes people don't finish school because, you know, they're queer and they don't have like access to a proper education. And like even in 2022, like us growing up in Manhattan, like in New York, me growing up here in Connecticut, very close to New York, where we have like New York money, and like just growing up in like a metropolitan area, like I personally sometimes forget that like some people grow up in not here, like in I don't even know where to say, but like nothing close to here.
Places with less amenities. I mean, that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about like places where it's safer to be poor versus like places where it's not. Like, you know, some places just like aren't even concerned with confronting that as an issue. Whereas like, you know, New York, for better or worse, because the situation of poverty and homelessness is so staggering, you know, like they have to do something about it. Exactly. You know, like they are compelled to by the, if only for the optics of it, you know, like whereas a lot of other places where it's like an issue, but not as, you know, like mass and visible, it's much easier to ignore it.
Exactly.
You know? And to not have those amenities available for people.
For sure.
And to, you know, reassert something you corrected. No, I would absolutely count Audre Lorde in terms of in the ranks of like people who have created accessible feminist literature. I think Sister Outsider, you know, like I don't think she was necessarily writing it with trans people in mind, but it's very helpful. Yeah. You know, like, and I don't think she didn't have, I think she had a message for the world. Yeah. You know, like another wonderful writer who's not with us anymore. Yeah. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I want to go back because one of my questions was about queers in punk. Personally, I have not had the most, like I was drawn to punk culture because it was an alternative culture that I aligned my values with. But when I got started, when I moved to New York, which is where I found punk, I was like, you guys aren't very queer, like anything. Like it's very like cis het white man dude, like bro, basically like wearing spikes, basically. And you said that like the goth community that you were with was a much more accepting. What was your experience like as a queer person, like in that sort of space? And I know that you are in a band, so I feel like you take up space, which is like beautiful, because going to Black Flags Over Brooklyn, I was like, this is the space I want to be at, and you were a part of that.
And I mean, that show in particular was like, I wish I could take credit for that, but that's entirely like thanks to my friend Kim Kelly's like excellent curatorship and like just knowledge of who's cool in the scene, you know? I have a similar experience too, especially growing up in New York hardcore punk, I feel like punk sometimes I feel like is this like person I have a long-term abusive relationship with. Like it's there's so many beautiful things about it, but what you're saying is correct. And like there are like particularly in New York, just like pockets of the scene that are incredibly racist and regressive and like bro-y and just like it's so weird. It's like this ostensibly outsider culture really just recreating the power structures that are external to it with no real sense of self-awareness or irony. I think it's hard. Like I think when I'm thinking about punk, I'm thinking broadly about counterculture.
That's what I'm
and the counterculture of like extreme music. So here I would include like scene kids and metal kids and goth kids and the whole broader, though I think within punk that's quite contentious. You know, and that's what like one of my issues with the scene is I never really felt embraced by like the kids who call themselves punk in New York. And here I'm gonna define that as like, you know, kids with studded leather jackets, you know, like or like Liberty Spice or whatever it is at the time, you know. I think in those scenes I was often looked at as like really weird. And like, even when I had friends in the scene, they'd be like, okay, but why are you into this other shit? And it's like, man, I don't know. Like, I don't know what, like, why do you care? Like, what, can I rock, you know, like, can you just let me rock? But,
Can I rock?
I think in later in high school, I ended up very much in like the like realm of like seeing kids swoopy haircuts. And that was a scene that I mean has as much homophobia, racism, etc. as like those other scenes. But I think it was mostly brown kids, which was just much more comfortable for me.
Yeah.
Black and brown kids from the outer boroughs, from East Brooklyn, the Bronx. Kind of like classic hardcore punk isn't really a thing as much in the Bronx. Like every once in a while you get that, but huge, you know. And there was like a venue for and like a whole scene around like there. I'm sort of nominally involved with, but I think yeah, punk is still hard. Like I would say that the music I play like very much growing out of the tradition of like crust punk and like the radical political punk of the 90s and thousands, particularly of like the Tennessee to Portland hardcore. But I still don't feel totally embraced by the community that's still in that genre. And I think it's funny, like, and something we want to talk about is like, oh, like where can people find community? And I would say to the intrepid queer young punk looking for your people, find queer people first. Like find queer people first and then find the queer punks and work your way out. I must say you do a lot of pain.
Yeah.
Because as much as you can with outsider culture, like that open-minded community.
Weird. So they're like, all right, let's just start our own subculture. And it's like, where do the people in the subculture like fit in? Like, why aren't you accepting of queer people if you are basically like, this is a movement for the people on the outside, like the people on, how, am I saying this correctly? Like the people on the outskirts. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The people outside the outside.
Well, something I talk to is like, and I wish I could have like really learned this when I was younger. Like a lot of times when you're trying to get involved in a scene, it can feel like no matter how hard you're trying at it, like you're just staying on the margin, especially when you have like, you know, intersectional identity stuff that sort of prevents you from meshing well with like the broad base of that scene. And it can feel like you're always on the margin. But to be honest, I don't actually believe there is a center. Like I think it's all margin. I think there is often the illusion of a center, and there are cliques for sure, but I don't think anyone's actually holding power in that. Like I don't think, I mean, there's to a certain degree, there's people who like book and run labels and they've got some coercive power over you. But outside of that, I think your average like fashionista is not going to dictate where your artistic career can go or like who you can be friends with. I like it feels that way. It feels very hierarchicalized and structured, and it is in a way, but it's an illusion, and it's not impossible to breach that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
we were talking about like DIY in our first panel and a little bit here as well. And if you feel like you need to break out of that specific cycle, like you can just go out and do something yourself. Like you can create your own record label, you can create your own band, you can create your own scene and be like, okay, we're doing this here now, like over here, and whoever is welcome to join, you know?
Yeah, and that's been the excellent lesson that I think, if anything's like positives come out of my experience in punk, and I think this has been both positively and negatively reinforced to me, is that like, yeah, if anything you want to do, you can do that yourself. Like And honestly, I think in terms of like defining your goals and taking action, you should assume no one's going to help you with it. You know, like I think people probably will, but don't count on it. You know, like
I mean, I'm the same way, but I think not everybody thinks like us because again, I'm an immigrant person. I've been doing parents' taxes since I was like 11 years old, so I am always like thinking that no one's going to help me and I have to do it myself. But there are other people like Kat who's like, no, I have community and like I am going to involve everybody like in on this.
Totally. I'm thinking more at the point of inception. Like my genuine belief is if you go and start doing your thing, I mean, I think you have to do it publicly. That's really key. Like, you know, playing guitar, if your goal is to play in bands or something, like playing guitar in your room is great and can be really therapeutic and helpful. But if you don't release your music, no one's going to step in to help you. No one's going to take an interest. But if you do, almost certainly someone will. Even like if you're not that good at it, just go out and be not that good at it.
Yeah.
Like, people will step in and be like, hey, why don't you try this? You know, like but you gotta become part of that conversation. And that again is something that like came much later in life than I'd wanted to. You know, like I wasted a lot of time feeling very self-conscious. And I still sometimes fall back into that. It's a tightrope walk, you know, because you want to be self-preserving and not totally expose yourself to the world in a way that like you just get damaged, but also you need to live in the world, you know. And I think that, you know, music is a social, is for most people a social activity, and doing it in isolation is like depriving yourself of a serious part of it. And honestly, I would say too, to like a young queer person, like queerness is a social activity. I think like
What is
queerness?
Oh, queerness, yeah.
I think your interiority is important, and it is important to like define yourself. But I think queerness, which is not performed externally, is at a certain point just navel gazing. You know, like you have to live in the world. And
what do you mean performative?
Like to be existing as a queer person.
Like
publicly.
Outwardly, like person.
And listen, like that's not safe for everyone. I don't want to say like, oh, like this is a moral impetus. Like you have to live, you know, like, and if it's the choice between life and death or like dying or being out as queer, obviously like you should live, you know, you should take the steps to preserve yourself and be safe. But I think sometimes there can be, I see articulated on the internet in particular a lot of sort of positions about queerness that I think wouldn't exist if they were actually happening in conversation and community. Like the internet queer community, to my eye, like encourages like, again, like a sort of obsession with interiority and like defining things in a really granular way that I think, you know, we were talking about categories earlier that like, again, I just don't think it would come into like an actual queer discourse, you know, like it can only kind of happen in this monologue, you know. I think maybe I'm not articulating myself as much as I could, but it's something I think about a lot.
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah. And this is not necessarily my idea. There's a very great Instagram I follow called Bimbo Theory that you know, I basically don't run a theory blog because she's already articulated all of my views really
but also queer theory is not very accessible to everybody just because of academia.
Totally.
And like because they're more of like a, not like a meme account, but like a graphics account, right? Where they like break down like queer theory, and like also Stone Butch Blues, I would say, is like a queer theory. You could easily write like a thesis on that book. Absolutely. Right? And so it just comes to that accessibility of easy to read literature, internet memes, basically.
But yeah, I think I want to be in a place to be encouraging people strongly to be queer publicly. I think it's incredibly important. I think, like you can't, the same way, like, I don't think you can find people to support your music without playing it publicly. I don't think you can find people to support your queerness without doing it publicly. And I think it's hard to not find some community if you come out.
I agree. Yeah. It's much harder. I mean, we have the internet now, which makes it a little bit easier, but like, you're not going to feel like you're in a community unless you're physically in a community.
Yeah, and like sharing that space with people is so important.
Yeah,
it's beautiful. Yeah,
this day has been, I mean, meeting so many people of like New Haven's queer community, making connections with people from Rhode Island's queer community, has just enriched my life. Like, there's no bad thing that I would say, but again, as you were saying, like, it's unsafe for people to come out, but like expressing. Like, I'll talk about myself and like the way I dress. I'm always like, we've got like those, what is it called? I'm saying the word in Portuguese in my head. Like, it's on the tip of my tongue. Like, when, like, you see like a lesbian walk down the street and like she's wearing a carabiner. What is that called?
Yeah.
Flagging. Well, not flagging. I was leading up to the flagging, but
I mean, I'm not sure.
It doesn't. Okay, my brain now is like turned off.
I'm aware of the carabiner stereotype.
Yeah, stereotypes. Thank you.
Sure.
Oh my god. And the word is literally stereotypical. Oh my god. I'm sorry. My brain literally turned off. I was like, you know the words. Because we were like a group of queers down the street. They were like, "Are you guys the Pride Center?" And I was like, "Yeah, we're the Pride Center." Like, but yes, flagging is a huge thing that happened much more frequently in the 90s and the 2000s. I don't see many people flagging now unless I go to like a specific party where it's like typically like a BDSM where people. I always encourage people to flag, like at our bar night that's happening at Three Sheets on Tuesday, April 26th. This person, I want to meet these kinds of people, and all you gotta do is flag. If they're in that, like, they will know, and like that, it's like a safer space, a safer way of like telling people that you're into something or without like wearing a name tag and is like, hi, like, I'm Suyane, I'm into leather or whatever, you know?
Totally. Mm-hmm. And funk is similar. Like, I definitely, grew up in the culture of like, you saw someone wearing a band shirt of a band you liked and you go talk to them.
Exactly. And
which I probably wouldn't do as an adult, but like.
I'm an extremely shy person.
Yeah.
Hopefully someone will come up to me and be like, I love Buffy. And I'm like, me too, let's be friends. Yeah.
No, totally.
Yeah. Okay, I'm just gonna hop into my next question. We've actually hit tons and tons of my questions.
We simply love it.
This is beautiful, and we're actually making great time. Oh, you are an eloquent speaker. This is beautiful.
I'm having a great time.
Oh, me too. Let's see a question that I didn't. Oh, let's talk about Riot Rhode Island real quick. Actually, this could be like a closer. I'll first ask you this question. How do you think DIY differs from NGOs? I know that we're both like, we both have similar, like a parallel job track. We're both like, we worked in restaurants, really shitty jobs. Now we're both like in an NGO, in a nonprofit, like doing really important work. How do you think those two, besides I guess the hierarchy and the funding? Well, I'll let you answer the question.
Well, I'm very happy to say that Riot has to be the most non-hierarchical place I've ever worked. Obviously, because it's an NGO structure, like there's a board. We have 2 executive directors, but like we have like a flat pay scale. Our instructors are paid the same as what the executive director is paid.
Oh.
And we are moving towards a collective sort of structure, but that's pending. I think I'm really lucky in Riot that it's like very horizontal. There's like a statement of purpose that it is horizontal, and not only within the organization, but like with our students and their parents and the broader community. Like we're very concerned with like living our politic. You know, we kind of think like that's the whole point, you know, like
of a nonprofit.
I mean, of what we're doing in particular. Like, we're not trying to necessarily run a music school, you know what I mean? We're trying to empower students, you know, like, and I even, you know, I started there as an instructor, and I sort of, when I talk about in teaching music, it's not even really something I believe in. Like, I'm a self-taught musician. I'm a DIY musician. I want to cheerlead people in pursuing their DIY music situation. And like, you know, they can come to me and say like, oh, I want to learn this song, and I'll help them with that. I can find a tab for them or something. But I'm mostly teaching them how to do it themselves.
Right.
You know, like that's what I want to teach. Like, and again, like, not to dismiss the idea of a music school. That's cool, but that's not what we're doing.
That's
you
like
know,
inspirational work versus like hear how chords progress, basically.
Totally.
You
and
know?
I mean, I can teach you that too while doing the other thing.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, I lost your question.
That's
in
okay.
Here.
And we can.
The difference between NGOs and DIY is there's a budget. And
NGOs.
Yeah, and in NGOs, not in DIY. Usually in DIY, you are operating as free as possible. Like, you want to spend as little money as possible. And I mean, I think, you know, NGO has something in common with that, but you're more likely to come into some money. But at the same time, you are not able to achieve goals as directly because you need to be soliciting those funds.
Yeah.
You know, like, you are preoccupied with fundraising. Like, that is most of the game, you know? Not that I think that's necessarily bad, because this is the difference, right? Is like, DIY is sort of, it's a tool, you know, it's one of the tools, but you to accomplish larger projects, right, you need to work in with people. And I think, you know, everyone approaching it from a DIY framework is really great, and you can build bigger structures. But yeah, there's like a give and take there, where like, I think some of the things that we're accomplishing with Riot, like, could not be accomplished under this system in a more anarchic way. You know, like, I think they, in a good world, you could do it in a self-assembling and voluntary way. But we're living in a slightly different world. And the like fundraising element is very necessary for doing something on the scale of like running a youth camp, you know,
which you guys are doing.
Yeah, which thankfully, like, we're going to do it for the first time since the pandemic. We're switching back to our pre-pandemic programming, and sort of wading into those waters and trying to identify what the new issues are. We're very concerned with like accessibility in terms of like testing and such, and those are ongoing conversations we're having. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I think the nonprofit industrial complex is much maligned and deservedly, but I'm living a kind of charmed existence in that I think Riot is very eager to not fall into those traps. And I'm sure we will, but you know, we're trying to be introspective and to stay on top of, you know, being an evolving program, and keeping on the edge of like what we need to be doing to serve our community. You know?
Yeah. And I think that's what like people, especially organizations, like what we need to be doing is just like striving for the better. Like, unfortunately, we're gonna fall into some traps. We're going to have some hard times, but what we can do is like take those and learn, and then like grow, basically.
And also, again, like, under the economic framework we exist in, I think any DIY project which grows large enough kind of has to become a nonprofit, or else not have enough security to sustain itself.
Yeah.
You know, like at a certain scale, like if you're, you know, at the not able to, you know, negotiate from a place of power with the landlord, for example, like you're and I mean, not that we should be aiming to create monuments or anything, but like it threatens the longevity of your project.
Yeah.
You know,
I feel like a lot of NGOs actually start from little passion projects. They're like, oh, I just wanted to do this, and then it kept growing, and now we're a nonprofit. You know.
And there's a situation with the Dirt Palace. The Dirt Palace, you know, grew out of those people like just being in a really low rent situation, and having the room to like be freaks and do their art. And at a certain point they were like, okay, like we need to own the building, you know, like we can't, they can't really, you know, sustain that project with the precarity of renting, you know, like.
Could you tell us actually what the Dirt Palace is?
Yeah, the Dirt Palace is it's a feminist arts collective. It's been in Providence. It was like the sister collective to the very famous like Fort Thunder DIY space that was downtown. But so they've been operating there for 20 years, and it's like a rotating residency. People have tended to stay between like 1 and 3 years on average. That we have the two like long-standing members of the group who run the Dirt Palace and the Wedding Cake House, which is a separate arts residency. But I guess it sort of aims to be a sort of like artist incubator. Like it's for the Dirt Palace in particular is for like younger artists to like have access to, like the facility has a screen printing shop and a practice space in it, and there's, you know, individual studios for people, and it's like a live workspace, you know. And I think the idea there is to like foster a community within like the members of the house and the alums of the house, and it has a storefront window so we can show artists, and also to like, you know, give people an opportunity to like pay low rent and work on their art in a way that like isn't really accessible if you're in an art situation. And that's certainly the case for me, like moving from Brooklyn to Providence to live in this arts collective. Like I have the most time to work on music I've had since high school, you know, like, yeah, it's really incredible. And yeah, I think again, like for their project, yeah, there came a point where, well, I think them growing it into the nonprofit was not only for like the security of like their situation in the building and like the ownership, but I think a desire to, again, like pursue a non-hierarchical thing. I think like when you're just operating as like a bunch of punks in a warehouse, right? Like the nepotism, and you want to be fair, you know? And I think that's like what they're striving towards with like, you know, there's a board now, you know, and like there's, you know, like sort of legacy planning sort of stuff. And yeah, I think like, yeah, when DIY projects grow to a certain degree, there's a natural sort of inclination to go that way. I think again, like it's not perfect, you know, like
it isn't.
If I could choose how things would go, that's not what I would pick, but you do the best you can, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, all right. That was actually beautiful timing. These are all the questions that I had, but if you want to plug anything in, this will be the time.
What I want to do is this, because we talked a lot about like, or I've talked a lot anyway about like things I wish I had when I was younger. It's like on the off chance that anyone is younger and feels like they're struggling breaking into punk or coming out as queer, or like, you know, like sort of finding their power in themselves to exist in the world the way they want to, like, please reach out. I don't have a million hours a day, but I can point you to a resource. You know, I'm happy to do that. If you go to my Instagram, my very silly handle is Body Improvement Club, all one word, no dots or underscores or anything like that. Shoot me a message. I'll respond to you. Like I'm happy to make myself available in that way. I might not be prompt, but I promise I will respond.
I will second that, because I literally just reached out to you and was like, hey, and you were the kindest. And now here we are.
It's mutual.
And this was beautiful. This is a beautiful talk. Thank you so much. Does anybody in the audience, or let me check if we have any comments over here.
And thank you. This has been such a pleasure.
Oh my God, you were amazing. And nobody, cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kai, for coming and talking to us. This is a beautiful conversation.
Thank you,
Literally,
Suyane.
it couldn't have been better. I can't imagine a better conversation. But yeah, we did it. We talked about everything. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
And thank you everybody here and at home for joining us. We've got technically 2 more programs today. We're going to be watching the indie lesbian film Walk With Me by Isabel del Rosal. I think, I should have wrote that down. But we're going to be having it here at the Pride Center. We're going to be having popcorn. So if y'all want to come on down, watch a movie with us. There's going to be a Q&A at the end with the cast and crew, and that'll be our Lesbian Visibility Day. Thank you all for joining us.